Once upon a time, in a grand, sprawling mansion on the edge of a quiet lake, there lived an old man named Arthur Blackwell. He was 60 years old, but his wealth and power had granted him the appearance of a man still clinging to his youth. His mansion was the crown jewel of his success, its towering walls covered in ivy, with balconies that overlooked the serene waters of the lake, where golden sunlight would reflect on clear mornings. Arthur had built his empire through decades of ruthless business dealings, accumulating wealth that few could imagine. He was known in the highest social circles as a man of ambition, charm, and cunning. His name struck fear in the hearts of competitors and inspired awe in those who dreamed of success. Yet, despite all his money and influence, Arthur Blackwell was a deeply lonely man. His life had been a series of transactions, deals struck, relationships sacrificed, moments traded for the next victory. Over the years, those who had once called him friend drifted away, and he pushed away anyone who might come too close, fearing the vulnerability that comes with genuine connection. But there was one person who remained by Arthur's side throughout the years. A quiet, loyal servant named Elias. Elias had been with Arthur for 25 years, arriving when the mansion was first built. At the time, he was a young man seeking work, and Arthur, seeing in him a diligent and disciplined nature, hired him as his personal servant. What began as a simple job turned into a lifelong service. Elias tended to Arthur's needs with unfailing dedication, managing the estate, caring for the household, and, as the years passed, becoming the only constant in Arthur's life. The truth was, Arthur had always taken Elias for granted. He was so absorbed in his own world of wealth and power that he rarely stopped to consider the life of the man who quietly stood in the background, ensuring that everything in Arthur's world ran smoothly. Elias never asked for anything in return, no recognition, no reward. He simply did his job with an unwavering sense of duty. And though he never said it out loud, Elias cared for Arthur in a way that went beyond employer and servant. He had witnessed the old man's triumphs and failures, his joy and sorrow, his pride and eventual decline. And through it all, Elias remained steadfast. For most of his life, Arthur never knew what it meant to love or to be loved. His relationships with others were built on manipulation and control, with the people in his life serving as tools for his success. But as he grew older, something began to shift. His wealth, once a source of endless satisfaction, began to feel hollow. The endless pursuit of more money, more power, more recognition, began to lose its appeal. And in the quiet moments of his grand mansion, Arthur would sometimes feel a cold emptiness, a void that neither his fortune nor his pride could fill. In a desperate attempt to stave off the loneliness that haunted him, Arthur began to entertain the company of younger women. The latest of these women was a stunning 25-year-old named Caroline. A socialite with a reputation for capturing the hearts and wallets of older, wealthy men. Caroline was breathtakingly beautiful, with golden hair that cascaded down her shoulders and eyes that sparkled with a mix of charm and calculation. She knew exactly how to get what she wanted, and when she saw Arthur Blackwell, she knew she had found her next target. Arthur, despite knowing better, was drawn to her youth and beauty like a moth to a flame. He knew deep down that Caroline was not in love with him. How could she be? He was twice her age, and their lives were worlds apart. But Caroline offered him the illusion of youth, the fantasy that he could still capture the passion and excitement he had long since left behind. And so, Arthur indulged her every whim. Lavish gifts poured in, diamonds that sparkled as brightly as Caroline's smile, a sleek sports car with leather seats that smelled of new money, and vacations to exotic locations where the two would dine under the stars, sipping champagne while the world watched in envy, for a time. Arthur was swept up in the fantasy. He felt alive again, like a younger version of himself, full of energy and purpose. Caroline's presence by his side made him feel as if he had conquered time itself. But while Arthur clung to the illusion, Elias watched the unfolding drama with a quiet, knowing gaze. He saw through Caroline's facade immediately, recognizing her for what she was, a woman who saw Arthur not as a partner or even a person, but as a means to an end. It pained Elias to see the old man fall into this trap, but as always, he kept his thoughts to himself, knowing it was not his place to interfere. As the months passed, Arthur's health began to deteriorate. It started slowly, occasional bouts of dizziness, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, fatigue that lingered no matter how much rest he got. At first, Arthur ignored the signs, too proud to admit that his body was failing him. But soon, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. Doctors were called, and tests were run, but the diagnosis was grim. Arthur's heart was weak, his body ravaged by years of stress and neglect. There was nothing they could do for him except make him comfortable in his final days. Caroline, upon learning of Arthur's condition, began to distance herself. The trips to his mansion became less frequent, the late-night phone calls became shorter, and her voice, once filled with feigned affection, grew cold. Arthur, bedridden and weak, could do little to stop her. He could see the truth now, the harsh reality that he had tried so hard to avoid. Caroline had never loved him. She had only loved his money, and now that his days were numbered, she had no reason to stay. One evening, as the setting sun cast a golden glow over the lake, Arthur lay in his bed, staring out at the view that had once filled him with such pride. His breathing was labored, his hands trembling as he tried to hold on to some sense of dignity in the face of his inevitable end. Beside him, as always, was Elias, standing quietly, waiting for any request his master might have. "Elias," Arthur croaked, his voice barely more than a whisper, "come closer." Elias moved to Arthur's bedside, kneeling beside him. He could see the pain etched in Arthur's face, not just the physical pain of his illness, but something deeper, a sorrow, a regret that had been buried beneath years of arrogance and pride. "I have something to say. And I don't have much time left," Arthur said, his voice trembling with the weight of his words. "I've been a fool. My whole life." Elias remained silent, letting the old man speak. He had waited years for this moment, though he had never hoped for it. "I thought wealth was everything," Arthur continued, his eyes staring off into the distance as if he were seeing his life unfold before him. "I thought if I had enough money, enough power, I could control everything. But I see it now. I was wrong. All those things I chased, they're meaningless." A tear slipped down Arthur's cheek, a rare display of emotion from a man who had spent his entire life keeping his feelings locked away. "Caroline. She never loved me. No one ever did. Except you, Elias. You've been here, all these years, and I never even thanked you." Elias felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he kept his composure, his voice steady. "I was only doing my duty, sir." "No," Arthur whispered, shaking his head weakly. "It was more than that. You've been more to me than anyone else ever has. More than any of those so-called friends, more than family. You've been the only one who truly cared. And I've been too blind, too proud, to see it. Arthur reached for the papers on his bedside table, his will. His hands shook as he tried to grasp them, but Elias gently took them from him, understanding what the old man was trying to say. "Everything," Arthur rasped, his voice barely audible now. "Everything I have. The mansion, the money, the businesses. It's all yours, Elias. You've earned it. More than anyone else." Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He had never expected this. For years, he had lived in the shadows of Arthur's wealth, content with his simple life of service. The thought of inheriting all of it, the vast fortune, the mansion, the businesses, was overwhelming. "Sir, I can't." "You can," Arthur interrupted, his voice firm despite his frailty. "You deserve it, Elias. More than I ever did. You've been a better man than I ever was. And I want you to have it." Tears welled up in Elias's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, not wanting to show his emotions too openly. "Thank you, sir," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Arthur's breathing grew shallower, each breath a struggle. His eyes, once sharp and piercing, now softened as they met Elias's. For the first time in his life, Arthur felt at peace. The weight of his regret seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of clarity and acceptance. "You're a good man, Elias," Arthur murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. "Better than I ever was." With those final words, Arthur Blackwell closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell one last time before stillness claimed him. The room was filled with an eerie silence, the only sound the distant patter of rain against the window. Elias remained kneeling by the bedside, his hands still resting on Arthur's. For a long time, he didn't move, his mind reeling with the enormity of what had just happened. The old man who had dominated his life for so many years was gone, and in his place, a vast legacy had been left behind. But more than the wealth, more than the mansion, what lingered in the air was the sense of loss. Of missed opportunities, and the tragic realization that Arthur Blackwell had spent his entire life chasing the wrong things. As the hours passed and the storm outside began to clear, Elias finally stood, his legs weak beneath him. He walked to the window, gazing out at the lake, now calm and still, the golden light of dawn breaking through the clouds. The world outside continued, indifferent to the monumental shift that had just occurred inside the mansion. In the days that followed, the news of Arthur Blackwell's death spread quickly. The will, which had been left with Elias, was finalized, and the estate passed into his hands. The world watched in shock as the story unfolded, a humble servant inheriting the vast fortune of one of the wealthiest men in the country. Reporters clamored for interviews, socialites gossiped about the scandal, and Caroline, upon learning that she had been left nothing, disappeared from public view, her ambitions dashed. But Elias had no interest in the spotlight. He refused interviews, ignored the media frenzy, and quietly went about his new life, much as he always had. The mansion, once a cold and empty symbol of wealth and power, became a place of warmth and kindness under his care. Elias used the fortune Arthur had left him to help those in need, donating to charities, supporting local businesses, and ensuring that the estate was a place where people were treated with dignity and respect. And though the mansion was now his, Elias still felt Arthur's presence in every room. He would often walk through the halls in the quiet moments of the evening, thinking of the old man and the life he had lived. Arthur's memory was not one of triumph or glory, but of lessons learned too late, of a man who had only realized the true value of loyalty and love in his final moments. As the years passed, Elias remained the quiet, humble man he had always been, but his life had taken on a deeper purpose. He had been given a second chance, one that Arthur had never had, and he vowed to live in a way that honored the lessons he had learned from the old man's life and death. The mansion, once filled with the cold echoes of greed and ambition, now stood as a testament to loyalty, compassion, and the quiet power of love. And for the first time in years, the house that Arthur Blackwell had built truly felt like a home.